Elena Carter sighed contentedly as she stepped into her new home, the heels of her shoes clicking against the polished hardwood floor. The spacious living room was bathed in golden afternoon light, casting warm hues over the modern furniture she had meticulously picked out. The house smelled of fresh paint and lavender scented candles, the perfect combination of new beginnings and comfort. She turned to her husband, Jason, who was carrying the last of their moving boxes through the door. Can you believe it? She said, excitement shimmering in her voice. We're finally here. Jason grinned, dropping the heavy box onto the kitchen island. Yeah, it feels unreal. But hey, after all the stress of house hunting, we finally have a place to call home. He walked over, wrapping his arms around her waist and pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. Welcome home, Mrs. Carter. She laughed, leaning into his embrace. It had been a whirlwind of events leading up to this moment. The wedding, the honeymoon, and now this dream house in an exclusive gated community in Houston. Everything was falling into place exactly as she had imagined. That evening, they settled onto the couch, still surrounded by unopened boxes, sipping wine and basking in the newness of their space. The soft hum of jazz music played in the background, and for the first time in weeks, Elena felt like she could finally breathe. The neighborhood was quiet, save for the occasional chirping of crickets outside. It was peaceful, almost eerily so. Just as she was about to comment on how perfect everything felt, a sharp knock echoed through the house. Jason raised an eyebrow, glancing at his watch. Who could that be? We don't know anyone here yet, he muttered, setting his glass down. Elena frowned. Maybe the welcome committee? Some neighborhoods do that, right? Curious, she padded to the door and peered through the peephole. Standing outside was a woman dressed in a tailored navy blue suit and an elegant pearl necklace. Her hair was swept into a flawless bun, and in her hands she carried an ornate gift box wrapped in gold foil. She exuded an air of wealth and power, the kind of woman who had lived in this neighborhood long enough to know everything about everyone. Elena hesitated for a second before unlocking the door and pulling it open with a polite smile. Good evening. The woman's red lips curled into a practiced smile. Good evening, dear. You must be Mrs. Carter. Her voice was smooth, like silk draping over glass. I'm Mrs. Gladwell, the chairwoman of the neighborhood association. I wanted to personally welcome you and your husband to our wonderful community. Elena felt Jason step up behind her, his presence solid and reassuring. Oh, that's very kind of you, she said. Would you like to come in? Mrs. Gladwell waved a manicured hand. Oh no, I won't intrude on your first night. I simply wanted to drop off a little something. A tradition, if you will. Every new resident receives a welcome gift from the association. She extended the elegantly wrapped box, her smile never wavering. Elena hesitated for the briefest moment before taking the package. It was heavier than she expected, the weight of it solid in her hands. Thank you, she said. That's really thoughtful. Mrs. Gladwell's eyes flickered, her smile deepening. I hope it brings you and your husband nothing but good fortune in your new home. Something about the way she said it sent a faint chill down Elena's spine. But before she could dwell on it, Mrs. Gladwell gave a polite nod and turned gracefully on her heels, disappearing into the night. Jason closed the door behind them, exhaling. Well, that was fancy. Elena chuckled. running her fingers over the gold ribbon. I guess that's what we get for moving into an upscale neighborhood. They walked back into the living room, setting the box on the coffee table. The moment of hesitation returned. Just a flicker of doubt, a whisper of unease. Jason must have sensed it because he nudged her playfully. Come on, aren't you curious? He teased. Open it. Elena took a deep breath and tugged at the ribbon, watching as it unraveled like silk. She lifted the lid, revealing an antique clock nestled inside, its face adorned with delicate golden filigree. She frowned slightly. It was beautiful, stunning even, but something about it felt off. The hands of the clock were frozen at exactly 3:00. Well, Jason said, peering over her shoulder. That's an interesting choice for a gift. Elena forced a smile, brushing aside the strange feeling curling in her stomach. Yeah, interesting. But deep down, she couldn't shake the thought that something wasn't right. Over the next week, neighbors began stopping by, each one bringing lavish gifts wrapped in shimmering paper and adorned with intricate bows. Elena had never experienced anything quite like it. There were gourmet chocolates, handcrafted candles, imported wines, and elegant home decor pieces, all delivered with wide smiles and warm welcomes. The people in this neighborhood weren't just friendly, they were overly welcoming, as if eager to make sure she and Jason felt like they belonged. At first, she was touched by the generosity. Every day, a new face appeared at her doorstep, their arms filled with something extravagant. A pair of elderly neighbors gifted them a hand-woven Persian rug. A young couple brought a rare bottle of vintage champagne. One woman, who introduced herself as Margaret from 3 houses down, handed Elena a delicate silver mirror, saying, "Every home needs a piece of reflection for clarity." The statement felt oddly cryptic, but Elena smiled and thanked her anyway. Jason, on the other hand, remained skeptical. I mean, this is nice and all, but don't you think it's a little too much? He asked one evening as they unpacked yet another set of expensive candles. Elena laughed, brushing off his concern. Maybe they just have a tradition of being really welcoming. You always say I'm too paranoid, but now you're the one being suspicious. Jason shrugged. I don't know. Something about this feels performative. Like they're trying too hard. He picked up the antique clock from Mrs. Gladwell's gift box, turning it in his hands. And this thing still weirds me out. I swear it moved last night. Elena smirked. You think we have a haunted clock? I think it's creepy, he corrected. It stopped at 3:00 again. She rolled her eyes. Maybe it's just broken. It's an antique after all. That evening, as they curled up on the couch, the house still smelling of fresh paint and scented wax, Elena scrolled through her phone, sending a message to Sophia Rise, her best friend since college. They hadn't spoken much since the move. But tonight, something about the gifts, the neighborhood, the lingering unease in Jason's voice, it made her want to talk to someone outside of this perfect, eerily accommodating community. You won't believe this. The neighbors here are so nice, it's almost weird. They keep bringing gifts. Like a lot of gifts. Sophia responded almost immediately. Weird how? Like expensive gifts. Antiques, wine, fancy candles. One lady gave me a mirror and said something about clarity. It's all very Stepford Wives. A few moments later, Sophia called. Babe, listen, I don't want to be that person, but you need to be careful. Elena frowned. Careful? Of what? Free stuff? No, Sophia said firmly. Of people who give without reason. Nothing in this world comes without strings attached. Elena sighed. Soph, come on. Not everything is a conspiracy. You don't find it strange? Sophia pressed. They don't know you. You just moved in. And suddenly, everyone's acting like you're royalty. That's not normal. Elena hesitated. She wanted to argue, to tell Sophia she was overreacting, but something in her gut twisted uncomfortably. Listen, Sophia continued. I know someone who had something similar happen. A friend of mine moved into this fancy neighborhood a couple of years ago, and the neighbors showered her with gifts too. Everything seemed fine. Everything seemed fine until things started going wrong. Elena's grip on the phone tightened. What do you mean? I mean, she started having nightmares. Her husband got sick. Their finances crashed out of nowhere. And guess what? The people who had been so kind to them suddenly weren't so friendly anymore. Elena's throat went dry. You think that's happening here? I don't know, Sophia admitted. But if I were you, I'd be very selective about what I keep in that house. Elena exhaled, shaking her head. You're being dramatic. Sophia sighed. Just promise me one thing. Pray over those gifts. At least once. Elena chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. All right, all right, all right, I'll bring out my sage and holy water. Not funny. I'm kidding. I'll pray, Elena assured her, though she wasn't convinced it was necessary. After hanging up, she wandered into the spare bedroom where she had stored most of the gifts. The room was cluttered with unopened boxes, ribbons still perfectly tied, luxury packaging gleaming under the soft overhead light. For the first time, she saw them differently, not as warm gestures, but as something else. Something waiting. Shaking off the creeping unease, she turned to leave, but just as she reached for the door, the antique clock chimed. The sound was deep, unnatural, as though it came from inside the walls rather than the object itself. Elena froze, heart hammering. She turned back slowly, eyes locking onto the clock. The hands had moved. 3, 0, again. Elena jolted awake, heart hammering in her chest. The room was bathed in darkness, but something felt off. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and her skin prickled with an eerie sensation she couldn't explain. She turned her head slightly, expecting to see Jason's peaceful sleeping form beside her, but instead, she found his side of the bed empty. Her breath hitched. Jason, she called out softly, but the silence that followed felt too dense, too unnatural. A faint creaking sound echoed from down the hallway, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing. Elena's pulse quickened. Jason wasn't a restless sleeper, and he certainly wasn't the type to wander around the house in the middle of the night. Swallowing back the unease creeping up her throat, she pushed off the covers and slipped her feet onto the cool hardwood floor. The moment she stepped out of the bedroom, A wave of cold air hit her like a gust from an open freezer. She shivered, hugging her arms around herself. Then she saw him. Jason stood in the dimly lit hallway, his back to her, completely still. Elena let out a small breath of relief, but immediately stiffened as she took a closer look. His posture was unnatural, rigid, tense, almost forced. His arms hung limply at his sides, his head tilted slightly downward, as though he were listening to something she couldn't hear. "Jason?" she whispered, hesitant to take another step forward. He didn't respond. A strange chill ran down her spine. She reached out cautiously, fingers barely brushing against his arm. The moment she touched him, his entire body jerked violently, as if pulled by invisible strings. He let out a sharp breath, eyes blinking rapidly, as if waking from a deep trance. "Elena?" His voice was thick with confusion, his brows furrowed as he looked around. "What? What am I doing out here?" "You were just standing here," she said, her voice unsteady. "You weren't moving. You weren't answering me." Jason ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his face clouding with unease. I, I, I don't remember getting out of bed." A long silence stretched between them. And then, from behind them, the clock chimed again. They both froze. Slowly, Jason turned to look at the antique clock hanging in the living room. The golden filigree gleamed under the dim hallway light, its hands frozen, exactly at 30 am. "Elena," Jason said carefully, his voice unusually quiet. "Did you hear that?" She swallowed hard. "Yeah, I heard it." Jason exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. "Maybe it's a wiring issue, an internal mechanism that resets every night." Elena wanted to agree. She wanted so badly to believe there was a logical explanation. But deep down, she knew this wasn't mechanical. This wasn't normal. They went back to bed, but Elena couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt watched, like something unseen was lurking just beyond the edge of the darkness. She listened intently for any more strange noises, but the house was silent, too silent. The next morning, as sunlight poured through the windows, the night's events felt almost distant, like a fading dream. Jason seemed to have already dismissed it as nothing more than sleepwalking, but Elena couldn't shake the unease. She hesitated before bringing it up again, but Jason was already moving on, burying himself in work calls and emails. By the time the afternoon rolled around, the eerie stillness of the previous night almost felt unreal. That was until the picture frame fell. Elena was in the kitchen, rinsing off a coffee mug, when the sound of glass shattering sent her heart into her throat. She whipped around, her eyes widening at the sight. Their wedding photo, the one they had lovingly placed above the fireplace on their first night, lay face down on the floor. The frame was cracked, the glass splintered into jagged pieces. She stared, unmoving. "Elena?" "What was that?" Jason called from upstairs. She barely registered his voice as she stepped forward, carefully picking up the frame. The glass sliced her fingertip, but she barely noticed the sting. Her focus was entirely on the photo itself. Something was wrong. Her and Jason's smiling faces were still there, but the background had changed. In the picture, behind them, where there should have been nothing but a softly lit reception hall. There was a shadowy figure, a tall, dark silhouette, blurred at the edges, watching them. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the frame tighter. Elena. Jason's voice came again, this time closer. She turned sharply, holding the frame up. Jason, look at this! His expression shifted from concern to complete confusion as he examined the photo. She stared at him, disbelieving. You don't see it? Jason shook his head. See what? Elena's blood ran cold. The shadow was there, clear as day, but Jason couldn't see it. Elena didn't sleep that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the image in the shattered frame over and over and over again. The shadowy figure, blurred and indistinct, had been watching them in the photo, lurking just beyond the glow of their wedding lights. It had no face, no form, just a darkness that didn't belong. But Jason hadn't seen it. That was what unsettled her the most. She had shoved the photo into the back of a drawer, too afraid to look at it again. Now, the only sound in the house was the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock in the living room, a sound she had grown to despise. At exactly 3:00 am, it chimed. Elena's body stiffened. She turned her head toward the door, listening. She held her breath, waiting for something, anything, to confirm that what she had been feeling wasn't just paranoia. And then a whisper, soft, almost unintelligible, but it was there. Elena bolted upright, her pulse hammering. Jason, she whispered, shaking him awake. He groaned, rubbing his face. What? Did you hear that? Jason sat up slowly, listening. Silence. Elena, there's nothing. His voice was thick with sleep. She shook her head. No, I swear, I heard something. Jason sighed, rubbing his temples. Babe, you're just on edge because of the photo. It was probably the house settling, or wind outside. Elena clenched her jaw. It wasn't the house settling. She knew what she had heard. But she also knew Jason wouldn't believe her unless he experienced it for himself. Still, sleep was impossible now. She climbed out of bed and made her way downstairs, flipping on the kitchen lights. The warmth of the glow did little to ease her nerves. She poured herself a glass of water, the coolness against her palm, grounding her for a brief moment. And then the clock started ticking louder. Elena turned her head sharply. The antique clock sat motionless, its golden filigree gleaming under the dim light. Yet the sound grew, intensifying, until it felt like it was right beside her ear. She pressed her hands against the counter, steadying herself. You're imagining it, she muttered under her breath. You're just... The kitchen lights flickered. She sucked in a sharp breath. The refrigerator hummed, then cut off abruptly, plunging the kitchen into a heavy, suffocating silence. And then, from the hallway, footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Elena's breath caught. She wasn't alone. She turned her head, eyes locking onto the darkened hallway leading to the living room. A figure stood there, just at the edge of the shadows. Tall, motionless, watching. Elena couldn't move. The weight of its presence pinned her in place. And then, in a voice so faint it barely reached her ears, Elena. The glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the floor. She scrambled back, nearly slipping on the spilled water, her heart racing as she reached for the light switch. The bulb exploded. Darkness swallowed the room. Elena? Jason's voice rang from upstairs. Heavy footsteps pounded down the steps, and within seconds, he was in the doorway, flipping the hallway lights back on. What the hell happened? Elena was trembling. She looked back toward the hallway. It was empty. I, I saw something, she stammered. There was someone standing right there. I heard my name. Jason's brows knitted together. Elena, you're scaring me. I'm scaring you. Her voice cracked. Jason, I saw it. It was here, right here. Jason stepped forward, glancing around the kitchen. The broken glass crunched under his shoe. He exhaled, running a hand down his face. There's no one here. Elena let out a shaky breath, dragging a hand through her hair. I swear to you, Jason, something is wrong with this house. With that clock, with those gifts. Jason hesitated. She saw it in his face, the flicker of doubt, the brief hesitation before he tried to rationalize it. But then he sighed. All right, let's say something is going on. What do we do? Elena swallowed. I need to call Sophia. Jason frowned. Elena? She told me to pray over the gifts, Elena cut in. And I didn't listen. But now She swallowed hard. I think she's right. I think we let something in. Jason didn't argue. Instead, he exhaled, pressing his lips into a thin line. Fine, call her. Elena nodded, gripping the counter as she steadied herself. She glanced back toward the living room. The clock was silent. But she knew. It was just waiting. Elena gripped her phone tightly, her fingers trembling as she dialed Sophia's number. The call barely rang once before Sophia picked up. Elena? It's nearly midnight. What's wrong? Elena hesitated, swallowing hard. Soph, I think you were right. There was a beat of silence on the other end. Then Sophia's voice sharpened. What happened? Elena turned slightly, glancing over her shoulder toward the dark hallway. The kitchen lights were back on now, casting long shadows against the walls, but they didn't make her feel any safer. Jason stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, watching her with cautious concern. I saw something, Elena whispered, voice barely audible. It was standing in the hallway. And I swear to God, Sophia, it whispered my name. The word sent a fresh wave of chills down her spine. Saying it out loud made it feel too real, too terrifying. Sophia's voice dropped to a near whisper. Did you pray over the gifts? Elena squeezed her eyes shut. No, I didn't take it seriously, but now, I feel like I should have. A long pause. Elena, Sophia said carefully, listen to me. You need to get those gifts out of your house. Elena's stomach twisted. She looked toward Jason, her voice lowering. It's not, Sophia said firmly, but you have to act fast. If those gifts are cursed, then keeping them there is only feeding whatever's happening. Elena felt a sharp pulse of dread crawl up her spine. I'll come over, Sophia added. Elena exhaled, relief flooding her. Thank you. Until then, don't be alone in any room. And whatever you do, don't touch the clock. Elena nodded, even though Sophia couldn't see her. Okay. After she hung up, she turned back to Jason, who had been listening the whole time. So, now what? He asked, running a hand through his hair. Elena glanced toward the living room, toward the spot where the antique clock loomed. We wait for Sophia, she said. But the house had other plans. The lights flickered. Elena and Jason both froze. Then, one by one, the overhead lights popped, plunging the entire kitchen into darkness. Elena gasped. Jason grabbed her wrist. Stay close, he muttered, his voice tense. A cold, unnatural wind seemed to swirl around them, even though every door and window was shut tight. The sound of whispers filled the space, low, overlapping voices, speaking in a language Elena didn't understand. Then came the footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They weren't coming from the hallway this time. They were inside the kitchen. Elena clutched Jason's arm, her entire body trembling. Jason, she whispered, do you hear that? Jason nodded stiffly, his breathing shallow. Then something moved in the darkness. A shadow shifting unnaturally, lurking just beyond their reach. Jason moved fast, grabbing his phone and flipping on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the empty floor. But they both knew something had been there. Elena, Jason said, his voice controlled but strained. We need to get out of this house. Elena nodded quickly. They backed away from the kitchen, moving toward the front door. Every instinct in Elena's body screamed that they were being watched, that whatever had been lurking in the shadows wasn't done with them yet. Just as Jason reached for the door handle, the antique clock chimed. Elena's entire body seized with terror. It wasn't just the sound. It was the way it rang. Slow, echoing, like a death knell. Jason turned sharply toward the living room, his flashlight landing on the clock. The hands were spinning wildly. Not forward, backward. Elena gasped, grabbing Jason's arm. Jason, we have to. Bang! Something slammed against the front door. Elena and Jason both jumped back, Jason instinctively moving in front of her. The doorknob rattled violently as if someone or something was trying to force its way inside. Elena, Jason hissed, get upstairs. Now. No, she whispered, shaking her head. The banging stopped. Silence. A deep, suffocating silence that felt too heavy, too wrong. Jason slowly reached for the door, gripping the handle. Elena held her breath. And then, a loud knock. A normal knock. Jason exhaled sharply. What the hell? Elena's pulse thundered in her ears. Jason hesitated, then unlocked the door and yanked it open. Sophia stood there, eyes wide, chest rising and falling rapidly. Jesus Christ, what took you so long? She breathed. Elena barely registered her friend's presence before she grabbed Sophia's arm and yanked her inside, slamming the door shut. Jason locked it behind them. Sophia looked between them, noting their shaken expressions. What the hell happened? Elena opened her mouth. And then the clock chimed again. Sophia stiffened instantly. Her eyes flickered toward the living room. When she saw the antique clock hanging on the wall, her face drained of color. "Elena," she whispered, "where did you get that?" Elena followed Sophia's gaze to the antique clock, dread pooling in her stomach. The way Sophia's face had gone pale, her normally sharp and confident expression replaced with something close to fear, made Elena's breath hitch. "It was a gift," Elena said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. Sophia turned to her sharply. "From who?" "Mrs. Gladwell," Jason answered, "the chairwoman of the neighborhood association. She gave it to us the day we moved in." Sophia exhaled shakily, rubbing her temples. "You need to get rid of it." Elena shivered. "You keep saying that, but why? What do you know?" Sophia hesitated for a moment, as if debating how much she should say. Then she squared her shoulders. "I've heard stories about objects like this. Cursed artifacts. Things that look normal but hold." Jason frowned. "Something like what?" Sophia's eyes darkened. "A binding. A way to attach something to a place. Or to someone." Elena's stomach churned. "You mean like a spirit?" Sophia's lips pressed into a thin line. "Or worse." A heavy silence filled the room. Jason let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "You expect me to believe that some evil spirit is trapped inside a clock?" Sophia's gaze flicked toward him, her expression unreadable. "Have you been sleepwalking, Jason?" Jason's smirk faltered. Elena's breath caught. "How did you—" "Because that's what happens," Sophia cut in. "It starts small. Strange noises, unexplained shadows, lost time. Then it gets worse. Whatever is attached to that thing is feeding off you, off your energy, your fears." Jason exhaled, running a hand down his face. He wasn't the kind to believe in ghosts or curses, but even he couldn't deny what had been happening. Elena swallowed hard. "So what do we do?" Sophia's expression hardened. "First we cleanse this place, and then we get that clock out of here." Elena nodded, but something deep inside her twisted with unease. She didn't know why, but the thought of removing the clock made her feel. Jason grabbed a trash bag, striding toward the living room. "Fine, let's get this over with." Elena and Sophia followed closely behind, their steps careful, measured. The moment Jason reached for the clock, the temperature in the room dropped. The air thickened, pressing against their skin like static before a storm. Elena's breath came out in a sharp, visible puff. Jason hesitated, fingers hovering just inches from the clock. "Why is it so?" Then the clock's hands began to move, not in a normal ticking motion. They spun wildly backward. Jason staggered back as the chime rang out, louder, deeper, unnatural. The walls trembled. And then a whisper, not soft, not distant, right beside Elena's ear. "You shouldn't have touched it." Elena screamed. The overhead lights burst, shattering glass across the floor. The room plunged into flickering darkness as shadows spilled from the corners, stretching unnaturally, reaching toward them. Sophia grabbed Elena's arm. We need to go. Now. Jason, still frozen in shock, barely reacted before Sophia yanked him backward. The three of them stumbled out of the living room, slamming the door shut behind them. Elena's heart was pounding. The whispers continued on the other side of the door, layered voices overlapping, rising and falling like a chorus of something inhuman. Jason's hands were shaking. What the hell was that? Sophia pressed a hand against her chest, breathing hard. I told you, it doesn't want to leave. Elena's body felt like it was humming, her skin ice cold despite the heat radiating from her own panic. Then how do we get rid of it? Sophia straightened, jaw tight. We don't. Not yet. If we remove it the wrong way, whatever is attached to it could attach to one of us instead. Elena's stomach dropped. So what do we do? Sophia met her gaze. We call someone who knows how to deal with this. Jason scoffed. Like who? A priest. Sophia's expression was dead serious. Exactly. Jason opened his mouth to argue, but Elena cut him off. Do it, she whispered. Jason turned to her. Elena. We have no other choice, she said, voice trembling. You saw what just happened. We can't fight this on our own. Jason hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line before he sighed, rubbing his temples. Fine. Call whoever you need to call. Sophia nodded and pulled out her phone, stepping away to make the call. Elena slumped against the kitchen counter, pressing her fingers against her temples. She could still hear the whispers. Soft, distant, waiting. Elena sat at the kitchen counter, gripping a steaming cup of tea that did nothing to stop the cold settling deep in her bones. The house was silent now, but it wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was waiting, watching. Sophia was still on the phone in the hallway, her voice hushed but urgent. Jason stood by the window, arms crossed tightly, his gaze fixed on the driveway as if expecting something, or someone, to appear. Elena swallowed hard, trying to focus on the warmth of the ceramic mug in her hands, trying to shake the feeling that if she let go, the whispers would start again. The worst part, she could still hear them, not loud, not clear, but faint, just at the edge of her consciousness, like a radio station playing beneath layers of static. A chorus of overlapping voices, slipping between syllables, speaking in a language she didn't understand, but somehow felt deep in her bones. The sound of Sophia hanging up the call made her jolt slightly. Reverend Matthews is coming, Sophia said, walking back into the kitchen. He'll be here in an hour. Jason let out a breath, raking a hand through his hair. And he can actually do something about this. Sophia shot him a sharp look. Do you have a better idea? Jason didn't answer. Elena took a deep breath. What do we do until then? Sophia hesitated before answering. We stay out of that room. No one argued. But deep down, Elena knew the house wasn't going to make it that easy. 1 hour later, the air in the house had grown thicker, like walking through water. Even with every light on, the shadows stretched unnaturally, clinging to the corners, warping the edges of the walls. Elena sat stiffly on the couch, her hands knotted together in her lap. Jason paced near the door, glancing at his watch, his nerves raw. Sophia kept her eyes locked on the hallway leading to the living room, as if expecting something to step out of the dark at any moment. And then 3 knocks. Not on the front door. On the living room wall. Elena's breath hitched. Jason froze mid-step. Sophia stood up immediately. The knocks came again, louder this time, more deliberate. Then something worse. A slow, drawn-out scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. It came from the inside the living room. Jason moved first, striding toward the front door and yanking it open. Reverend Matthews stood there, dressed in a simple black suit, a worn leather Bible in one hand, a small bottle of oil in the other. The moment he stepped into the house, his expression changed. He stiffened slightly, his eyes scanning the space, his face etched with something that looked like recognition. "Where is it?" he asked. Sophia gestured toward the living room. "Inside." Reverend Matthews nodded once, stepping forward. But as soon as he crossed the threshold into the hallway, the air shifted. The overhead light flickered violently, casting shadows that moved on their own. Elena's heart pounded. Reverend Matthews exhaled, his expression grave. "We need to act quickly." Jason clenched his jaw. "What is it?" The Reverend turned to him, his voice calm, but firm. "A binding." Elena's stomach twisted. "You mean a curse?" Reverend Matthews hesitated. "Not just a curse, a deliberate tie. Something or someone wanted to attach this presence to you." Elena's hands felt suddenly clammy. "Why?" The Reverend didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved toward the living room. The closer he got, the colder the air became. Elena felt it. Jason did too. The pressure against their skin, the way the air felt wrong, like they had stepped into a room where they didn't belong. The antique clock sat in its usual place on the wall, but the hands were spinning, not wildly like before, controlled, deliberate. Reverend Matthews took a deep breath and opened his Bible. "This thing doesn't want to leave." A shiver crawled down Elena's spine. "Then how do we get rid of it?" The Reverend glanced at her. "We make it leave." Elena felt Jason's hand close around hers. His grip was tight, reassuring, but she could feel the tension in him. Reverend Matthew stepped forward, and then the clock stopped spinning. Everything went still. Too still. Then the lights went out. The room plunged into complete darkness. Elena's breath came in shaky gasps. Then the sound of laughter. Not human, not right. Something was in the room with them. A deep, guttural laughter filled the darkness. It wasn't human. It wasn't right. It echoed from everywhere and nowhere at once, weaving through the room like an invisible force slithering against their skin. Elena's breath came out in sharp, shallow gasps. Jason's grip on her hand tightened, his fingers ice cold. Then a whisper, low, mocking. "You shouldn't have brought him here." Reverend Matthews stood motionless, his fingers gripping his Bible tightly, his gaze locked on the antique clock. Though they couldn't see his face in the darkness, Elena felt something shift in the air, a clash of forces she didn't understand. Then, in a voice steady and unwavering, the Reverend spoke. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" The moment the words left his lips, the room shook violently. The laughter twisted into something angry, a distorted wail that seemed to crack the very air around them. Then, footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming straight toward them. Elena's heart pounded as she felt the presence inch closer. The darkness was alive, pressing against her, suffocating her, as if something unseen was watching her through the void. Then, a burst of light. Reverend Matthews lifted a small, flickering candle, the flame too bright for such a small source. It cast jagged, elongated shadows across the walls, but more importantly, it revealed something standing in the corner of the room. Elena gasped. A figure loomed near the wall, tall and unnatural, its form shifting like smoke barely held together in human shape. It had no face, just darkness where features should have been. And yet she felt staring directly at her. Jason swore under his breath, stepping protectively in front of her, but the Reverend didn't falter. He took a step forward, lifting his Bible. "You have no place here." The thing in the corner tilted its head, almost curious. The shadows around it quivered, the air vibrating with something old and malevolent. Then it spoke. "She let me in." Elena froze. The room seemed to tilt, her mind struggling to process the words. "She let me in." A chill ran down her spine as she whispered, "What? What do you mean?" The thing in the shadows shifted again, its form glitching, as if it wasn't meant to exist in this world. Then it lifted one long skeletal hand and pointed at the clock. Elena's throat went dry. "No," she whispered. "I didn't." "You accepted it," the voice rasped. "You brought it into your home." Elena shook her head violently, her pulse hammering in her ears. "No, no, no, this wasn't her fault. She had just... she had just... A memory flashed through her mind. Mrs. Gladwell, standing at their doorstep, that perfect, poised smile stretching across her lips as she handed Elena the beautifully wrapped gift. "I hope it brings you and your husband nothing but good fortune in your new home." And she had smiled. She had taken it. She had said thank you. Elena's stomach twisted in horror. She had let it in. Reverend Matthew's voice cut through the suffocating tension. "She did not invite you. You deceived her. And now you will release her." The shadow lurched forward, the walls vibrating with an unseen force. The antique clock suddenly rattled on the wall, its hands spinning wildly backward. A wind unlike anything Elena had ever felt rushed through the room, slamming into them like an invisible wave. Jason grabbed her as the force intensified, the pressure pushing them back. The Reverend held his ground. With deliberate intent, he uncapped the small bottle of oil and threw it toward the clock. The moment the droplets hit the surface, the room erupted in sound. A screech, raw and inhuman, echoed through the space as if something was being ripped apart at the seams. The shadows convulsed, the dark figure recoiling violently, and then the glass on the clock cracked. A hairline fracture splintered across the surface, spreading like a spider web. Elena barely had time to react before the clock exploded. Shards of glass and twisted metal shot outward, the force of it sending them all staggering backward. The figure let out one final, soul-wrenching wail before its form began to disintegrate, melting into the darkness like ink dissolving in water. And then silence, a deafening, hollow silence. Elena gasped for air, her entire body shaking. Jason's arms were still wrapped around her, his chest heaving. Reverend Matthew stood unmoving, his gaze fixed on the shattered remains of the clock. It was gone. The presence, the suffocating weight, the unnatural cold. Gone. Elena let out a shaky, disbelieving laugh, pressing a trembling hand to her chest. And for the first time in weeks, she felt light. Elena exhaled shakily, pressing her back against Jason's chest, her entire body still trembling from what had just happened. The house, so full of shadows and whispers just moments ago, now felt eerily quiet, like the air itself had been purged of something unseen. The shattered remains of the antique clock lay scattered across the floor, tiny fragments of glass reflecting the dim overhead light. The space where it had once hung now bore a dark, scorched mark, as if something had been burned away from existence. Jason ran a hand down his face, still breathing heavily. "Tell me that's the end of it," he muttered. Reverend Matthews didn't respond right away. His gaze was still fixed on the spot where the entity had disappeared, his fingers gripping the worn leather of his Bible. Then, finally, he spoke. "It's weakened, but it's not gone." Elena's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, not gone?" Reverend Matthews turned toward them, his expression grave. "Whatever was attached to that clock, whatever fed off your presence here, it wasn't just a simple spirit. It wasn't just a simple spirit. It was something older, more deliberate." Jason's jaw tightened, and the Reverend exhaled, stepping over the broken glass. "It's been driven out of this house, but that doesn't mean it's been destroyed. That kind of darkness, it lingers, it waits." He looked directly at Elena. "It will look for another way back." A slow chill crawled up her spine. "Another way?" Sophia, who had been silent throughout the exorcism, finally spoke. "You mean through Elena?" The Reverend hesitated before giving a slow, solemn nod. Elena's breath caught in her throat. "No," Jason said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "No way. If it tries anything, we'll stop it." The Reverend's gaze softened, but his voice remained firm. "You must be careful. Just because you've removed the object doesn't mean the connection is severed. It's like tearing out weeds. If you don't remove the roots, they grow back." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling exposed. The realization settled heavily in her mind. She had let it in once. Could she keep it out if it tried again? Sophia reached over and squeezed Elena's hand. "Then we cut the roots," she said simply. Elena glanced at her, eyes searching for any doubt, but there was none. Sophia had always been the strongest one, the voice of reason when fear threatened to take over. Jason nodded. How do we do that? Reverend Matthew studied them for a moment before speaking. First, you must leave this house. Elena's heart skipped a beat. Leave? Yes, he confirmed. This house was its anchor. Even with the clock destroyed, the energy remains. The safest course of action is to remove yourselves from this place entirely. Jason let out a slow breath. That won't be a problem. Elena turned to him, surprised by the certainty in his voice. He met her gaze. We're not staying here, Elena. She wanted to argue, to say it was their home, that they had spent so much time trying to make it theirs. But as she looked around, the scorched wall, the shattered glass, the heavy weight of something still lurking in the silence, she knew he was right. This house would never be theirs. It had belonged to something else the moment they stepped inside. She nodded slowly. Okay. Relief flashed across Jason's face. The Reverend took a step back. I'll return tomorrow with materials to cleanse you both. Until then, pray, stay together, and don't, under any circumstances, open your doors to anyone you don't know. Elena's fingers tightened around Jason's hand. Understood. Sophia exhaled. I'll stay with them tonight. Reverend Matthews gave a final nod before heading toward the door. But before he left, he turned back, his expression strangely distant. Elena, he said carefully. She looked up, her throat dry. Yes. His eyes locked onto hers, dark and unreadable. The weight of those words settled over her like a cold hand pressing against her skin. Yes, she whispered. The Reverend's lips pressed together in a firm line. That means it knows you now. Elena felt her heartbeat stutter. Knows her. Not the house. Not Jason. Her. She forced down the fear threatening to consume her. What does that mean? The Reverend studied her for a long moment before saying, It means you have to be stronger than it thinks you are. And with that, he left. Elena stood frozen in place, her mind replaying his words. Knows her. Not gone. Looking for another way back. Jason pulled her into his arms, pressing a kiss against the top of her head. We'll get through this, he murmured. Elena held onto him tightly, but deep in her gut, she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Elena lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing, despite the exhaustion pressing down on her like a heavy weight. Jason's slow, steady breathing beside her should have been comforting, but it wasn't enough to silence the echoes of Reverend Matthew's words. It knows you now. She hated how those words stuck in her mind, like a seed burrowing deep into her subconscious, waiting to bloom into something dark. The house was quiet, too quiet. Sophia was sleeping in the guest room, her presence a reassurance, but Elena still felt like she was being watched. She shifted onto her side, curling up slightly as her gaze drifted toward the bedroom door. The hallway beyond it was dark, a void that felt like it was waiting for her to close her eyes. She squeezed them shut, forcing herself to breathe in slow, measured counts. In, out, in, out. Then, a creak. Her eyes snapped open. It came from the hallway. Elena's breath hitched. At first, she thought she had imagined it. Maybe it was the house settling, a trick of her exhausted mind. But then Another creak, and this time it was closer. A slow, deliberate step just beyond the door. Elena's body went rigid. Her fingers curled into the sheets, her heart hammering so loud she was afraid whoever, or whatever, was outside would hear it. She turned her head slightly, her mouth going dry as she stared at the thin sliver of light under the door. A shadow moved across it. Elena's blood ran cold. She held her breath, praying Jason would wake up, but he remained still beside her, lost in sleep. The shadow stopped directly in front of their door, and then the handle turned. Elena shot upright, grabbing Jason's arm and shaking him. "Jason," she whispered urgently. "Wake up!" He groaned, half asleep. "What?" The handle twisted again. Elena clamped a hand over her mouth to stop the scream rising in her throat. Jason finally stirred, blinking blearily at her. "Elena, what?" Then he heard it. His body tensed immediately, his hand reaching instinctively for the baseball bat he had left by the nightstand after the last few nights of terror. The handle jiggled harder now, like something was testing the lock. Then, 3 slow knocks. Not rushed, not frantic, just patient. Jason shot out of bed, moving toward the door, but Elena grabbed his wrist. "Don't," she whispered fiercely. Jason hesitated, muscles taut, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might break. But he didn't move any closer. The knocking stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then, from the hallway just beyond the door, a voice, soft, familiar. "Elena, let me in." Her entire body locked up, because it wasn't a stranger's voice. It was her mother's. Jason's eyes widened as he looked at her, seeing the terror on her face. "Elena, sweetheart," the voice cooed. "It's just me. Open the door, darling." Elena's hands shook violently. "No, no, this wasn't real." Her mother was in their home state, hundreds of miles away. Jason moved in front of her protectively, gripping the bat like he was preparing for whatever was on the other side. "Sweetheart," the voice repeated, gentle and coaxing. Elena bit down on her lip so hard she tasted blood. Because she knew. She knew if she answered, if she let even one syllable slip, it would get in. Jason must have sensed it too, because he whispered, "Don't say anything." She nodded, squeezing his arm in silent agreement. Then, a long, heavy silence. The air thickened, pressing down on them like invisible hands. Then, the voice changed. It wasn't soft anymore. It wasn't coaxing. It was low, twisted, inhuman. "Let me in." The door rattled violently, the entire frame shaking as if something on the other side was trying to tear it from the hinges. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Jason gritted his teeth, his grip on the bat white-knuckled. Then, a loud bang. A thud against the door. Then, another. And another. Each one harder, more violent, shaking the walls, making the air hum with some unseen force. And then it stopped. Silence. Jason didn't move. Elena didn't breathe. Minutes passed. Then, from outside, from deep in the hallway, the voice whispered one last time, "I'll come back for you." Then, footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps retreating down the hall. Jason and Elena stayed frozen, listening until the sound disappeared completely. Jason moved first, carefully unlocking the nightstand drawer and pulling out his phone. He dialed. Sophia answered groggily. "Jas, what?" "You need to call the Reverend," Jason cut in. "Now." Elena barely heard Sophia's response. She was still staring at the door, at the handle, at the faint imprint of fingers still pressed against the wood. Elena didn't sleep. She couldn't. Not after what had just happened. She stayed curled against Jason, his arm wrapped tightly around her as if he could physically keep her anchored in reality. But even his presence wasn't enough to erase the imprint of those fingers on the door, the weight of the words still lingering in the air. "I'll come back for you." It had used her mother's voice. It had spoken like it knew her, like it belonged in her home, in her life. She felt sick. Jason had barely let go of her long enough to call Sophia, his voice low and sharp, demanding that she get Reverend Matthews back to them immediately. Sophia didn't argue. She'd heard enough in Jason's tone to know that whatever had happened, it was worse than before. Now, all they could do was wait. Jason kept his eyes locked on the bedroom door, the bat still gripped tightly in his hands. He hadn't spoken much since the voice disappeared, but his body was tense, his muscles coiled like he was ready to fight something neither of them could see. Minutes passed, then an hour. The house remained still, but Elena felt it. It was still there, watching, waiting. Another hour later, headlights cut through the darkness outside. A car. Elena sat up so fast she nearly fell off the bed. Jason was already moving, unlocking the bedroom door and striding toward the front entrance. His movements stiff, careful. Elena followed, her breath shallow as she peeked through the peephole. Reverend Matthews and Sophia. Relief flooded her so suddenly she nearly collapsed. Jason swung the door open before they even had a chance to knock. The Reverend stepped inside first, his presence immediately shifting the air in the house. He stiffened, his gaze flicking around the space like he could see something they couldn't. His eyes landed on Elena, then drifted to the bedroom door behind her. "You saw it," he said, his voice grave. Elena swallowed hard. "It spoke to me." Reverend Matthews nodded, unsurprised. "And what did it say?" Her fingers curled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. "It used my mother's voice." She forced herself to meet his gaze. "It asked me to let it in." The Reverend's jaw tightened. "But you didn't." She shook her head quickly. "No, but it tried. It banged on the door. She hesitated, her voice dropping into a whisper. "It said it would come back for me." Sophia swore under her breath. Jason's fingers twitched around the bat, his face set in stone. Reverend Matthews exhaled. "It's becoming desperate." "Desperate for what?" Jason snapped. The Reverend turned toward him, his expression unreadable. "For her." A cold weight settled in Elena's chest. Sophia stepped closer. "So what do we do now?" The Reverend didn't hesitate. "We end this. Tonight." Jason exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "And how exactly do we do that? Because last time we thought it was over, it..." He gestured toward the house. "It wasn't." Reverend Matthews turned to Elena. "Where did it speak to you?" Elena pointed toward the bedroom. "Through the door. It was in the hallway." The Reverend nodded once. "Then that's where we start." Elena's pulse quickened. "Start what?" His gaze was steady. "The banishment." The word sent a violent shiver down her spine. Jason adjusted his grip on the bat. "And if it fights back..." Reverend Matthews didn't blink. "It will..." The next few moments moved in slow motion. Reverend Matthews reached into his bag, pulling out small white candles, a vial of oil, and a handful of what looked like coarse salt. He handed a candle to each of them. "Light these," he instructed. "No matter what happens, do not let them go out." Elena's hands shook as she struck the match, the tiny flame flickering to life. The Reverend moved first, stepping into the hallway. He poured a thin line of salt along the floor, his voice low as he whispered an ancient prayer. Jason followed, keeping himself between Elena and whatever unseen force might try to reach for her. Then the house groaned. A deep, resonant sound, like wood and stone protesting their movements. The shadows shifted. Elena felt it before she saw it. A ripple in the air, a distortion, like something was pressing against reality itself. Then, just beyond the candlelight, it appeared. A shape, a presence, not fully formed, not entirely solid, but there, watching, waiting. Elena's breath hitched. Reverend Matthew's voice rose. "You have no power here." The shadows quivered, pulsing in and out, the air vibrating with unseen energy. Then it moved. The darkness surged forward, rushing toward them like a storm. Jason yanked Elena behind him, his candle flickering wildly. Reverend Matthews didn't flinch. He threw something, a handful of what looked like ashes or dust, directly into the oncoming mass. The effect was instantaneous. The entity screeched, a raw, unnatural sound that sent a shockwave of energy rippling through the house. Elena stumbled backward, barely catching herself as the walls began to shake. And then the lights went out. The only glow remaining came from the candles in their hands, casting erratic shadows against the walls. The darkness didn't retreat. It gathered. It coiled. And then it struck. The darkness lurched forward. It didn't move like a living thing. It didn't have a body or limbs or a face. It was a force, a shifting, writhing presence that surged toward them, carrying with it a crushing weight of malice. Elena barely had time to react before the entire house shook violently, as if something enormous had slammed into its very foundation. She stumbled back, gripping Jason's arm for balance as her candle flickered dangerously in her trembling hands. Reverend Matthews stood firm, lifting his Bible. His voice rose above the chaos, steady and commanding. "In the name of the Almighty, I cast you out." The air crackled like a storm about to break. The shadows screeched, an ear-splitting, unnatural wail that didn't belong to this world. The temperature plunged, a breath-stealing cold, swallowing the space around them. And then it hit. A gust of unseen force exploded outward, knocking Elena off her feet. She barely caught herself before her knees hit the floor, her candle tumbling from her grasp. Jason lunged forward, grabbing her before she could fully collapse. Elena! His voice was sharp. Panicked, her candle had gone out. And the moment it did, the darkness rushed toward her. Jason reacted instantly. Without hesitation, he shoved his own candle into her hands. Elena, hold on to this. She grasped the wax tightly, fingers curling around the base, the flame wavering but still alive. The darkness halted. It recoiled violently, as if burned, shrinking away from the fragile light that now stood between them and it. Reverend Matthews pressed forward, stepping past Jason, unshaken, his voice commanding. "You are not welcome here!" The entity shrieked, a sound that felt like it was tearing through their very bones. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, clutching Jason's hand as the walls rattled, the furniture groaned, and the shadows whipped wildly around them like a storm trapped within four walls. And then the clock struck 3. But the clock was gone. The deep, reverberating chime echoed through the house, vibrating through the very air, though there was nothing left of the cursed object that had started all of this. Elena's breath hitched. It was still tied to them. "Reverend," Sophia gasped, barely keeping her own candle steady as the shadows clawed at the edges of the light, circling, waiting. Why isn't it leaving? Reverend Matthews lifted the vial of oil, moving swiftly, splashing it along the floor, onto the walls, across the burned spot where the clock had once hung. And then he spoke the final words of the banishment. "By his power, I break this tether. By his name, I sever this bond. Be gone." The world erupted. A blast of wind surged outward, throwing them back, a shockwave of raw, violent energy pouring through the house. The candles flickered, threatening to die out completely, but at the last second, the darkness screamed. Not just with rage, but with fear. It fractured, splitting apart, the tendrils of shadow splintering like glass under a hammer. The screeching sound rose higher, higher, and then silence. Elena gasped, her entire body trembling. Jason's arms were around her, his own breath ragged. The room was still. The shadows were gone. The oppressive weight of the presence that had suffocated their home for weeks lifted. Sophia's candle was the first to gutter out. Then Jason's. Elena's was the last to die, the flame flickering softly before vanishing into the air. It was over. For a long time, no one spoke. No one moved. Then Jason let out a shaking breath. "Is it?" Reverend Matthews stepped forward, his shoulders relaxing for the first time. He closed his Bible gently. "It's over." Elena felt her knees give out, and Jason caught her instantly, holding her tightly against him. The tears came without warning. Silent, overwhelmed relief. Jason pressed his lips against her temple. "We're okay," he whispered. "We're okay." And for the first time in weeks, Elena believed it. 1 month later, The old house sat empty. Elena stood beside Jason in the driveway, watching as the moving truck pulled away, carrying the last of their belongings. Sophia sighed, crossing her arms. I still think you should have burned the place down. Elena let out a small, exhausted laugh. Trust me, the thought crossed my mind. Reverend Matthews had insisted on one last blessing before they left. The house was cleansed. There was nothing left of the entity that had haunted them, but still, neither Elena nor Jason could stay. This house had never truly been theirs. They were free now. Elena turned to Jason, who met her gaze with the same quiet understanding. He squeezed her hand. New beginnings. She smiled softly. New beginnings. Sophia groaned. Just promise me your next house won't come with a haunted gift basket. Elena chuckled. No gifts. Ever again. They all shared a laugh, the tension finally melting away. Elena glanced back at the house one last time. It was just a building now. Nothing more. But as they turned toward the car, Elena could sworn just for a second that she heard it. A faint ticking, like a clock with no hands, waiting, watching. But when she turned back, there was nothing there. This story is more than just a tale of supernatural horror. It's a powerful reminder that not all gifts are blessings and not all kindness is genuine. Sometimes what appears to be a token of goodwill can carry hidden intentions, unseen consequences, or even darkness waiting for an invitation. Elena and Jason's ordeal teaches us the importance of intuition and discernment. We often accept things, whether physical gifts, relationships, or opportunities, without questioning their true origins or potential impact on our lives. Yet, what we allow into our homes, our minds, and our hearts can shape our reality for better or worse. Another key takeaway is that evil thrives in silence and ignorance. The more Elena ignored the signs, the stronger the force grew. But the moment she sought help, confronted the truth, and took action, she reclaimed control over her life. In the same way, we must be vigilant against negativity, manipulation, or toxic influences, recognizing them for what they are before they take root. Above all, this story reinforces that faith, courage, and unity can overcome even the darkest forces. Whether you believe in the supernatural or not, there is undeniable strength in standing together, facing fear head on, and refusing to let it define you. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling tales. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and always trust your instincts.